Lance Stroll crossed the line to a hero's welcome at the 2023 Bahrain Grand Prix, having finished 6th just 2 weeks after a bike crash that left him with broken wrists and a fractured toe. Of course, it's no surprise why he rushed back, his Aston Martin now capable of regular podium finishes, but he's definitely not the first F1 driver to race through the torment of injury. Stroll's valiant Bahrain efforts follow in the wheel tracks of some of F1's most dedicated drivers, who have endured unimaginable pain in order to compete. From incredible F1 returns to bizarre attempts to ignite a motorsport career, here are 9 drivers who broke through the pain barrier. Lance Stroll was in noticeable pain throughout his time in Bahrain, unsurprising given the fractures to his wrists, hand and right big toe that he had sustained just 2 weeks earlier. Crashing his bike in Spain, Stroll was told by his medical team that he should expect to miss the first 2 races of the season at least, targeting a comeback shortly after the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. But after undergoing successful surgery on his right wrist just 48 hours after the accident and pushing through a rehabilitation program, Stroll found himself able to race in Bahrain while still experiencing considerable pain. Unable to use different racing lines during qualifying, seen wincing during the national anthem, and even talking of weeping into his helmet after the jolt of hitting his teammate on the opening lap. Of Jackie Stewart's 27 Grand Prix victories, his triumph at the 1968 German Grand Prix is arguably his most impressive. At a rain-soaked and fog-smothered Nürburgring, Stewart had qualified 6th for Tyrrell Matra, receiving the all-clear to race after fracturing his right arm during a pre-season Formula 2 test. After a delayed start, Stewart quickly moved up to 4th by turn 1, his car using Dunlop wets with wide drainage grooves, giving him a significant advantage on a track which had rivers of water running across it. Halfway round the opening lap, Stewart had moved up into 2nd, surpassing Jochen Rindt and Chris Amon, and by the end of it, he led Graham Hill by a 9-second margin, never looking back. Stewart went on to win by a scarcely believable 4 minutes and 3.2 seconds, battling a sticking throttle and tumbling oil pressure, all whilst nursing a broken arm, in a race that never should have been started. In perhaps the most astounding F1 comeback of all time, Niki Lauda braved severe facial burns and bleeding wounds to return for Ferrari at the 1976 Italian Grand Prix, just 42 days after a near-fatal crash at the Nürburgring. In pursuit of title rival James Hunt, Lauda became trapped in his Ferrari, which had crashed heavily and ignited at the German Grand Prix. Eventually pulled to safety and not expected to survive, even being read his last rites, it was a near miracle that Lauda qualified 5th at Monza ahead of Carlos Reutemann, the driver Ferrari had hired to replace him. The reigning world champion then recovered from a slow start during the race to pass Reutemann again, claiming 4th and a deserved hero's welcome as his Ferrari crossed the finish line. Nigel Mansell's F1 career got off to a rather painful start, lining up last for the 1980 Austrian Grand Prix, with petrol slowly leaking into his cockpit. While such a discovery would probably make most drivers end their race there and then, mechanics tried to dilute the mixture, pouring water down Mansell's back. But as the race got underway, the chemicals began to administer 1st and 2nd degree burns on his skin. His suffering would last for 40 laps, his Ford engine finally giving out and allowing him to retire, but his determination ultimately earned him a full-time drive for the following season. Even whilst piloting an underpowered Alpine, Fernando Alonso was in contention for pole position at the 2022 Australian Grand Prix, going fastest in the 2nd sector of the Albert Park circuit before his lap came to an abrupt end. Entering turn 11, the Alpine's hydraulics failed, forcing the car to career off into a gravel trap and slam into a tyre wall. The impact and the sudden snap of the steering wheel broke small bones in Alonso's wrists and hands as he tried to keep the car on track. Although painful, the Spaniard was cleared to race in Sunday's Grand Prix, where he started 10th but ultimately fell to 17th due to poor race strategy, doomed by a flurry of full and virtual safety cars. Alonso didn't recover fully from his injuries until the summer break, but still managed to fight at the front of the field, even capturing P5 at Silverstone and P6 at Paul Ricard. Ahead of his years spent dominating the F1 grid, Lewis Hamilton clung to a future drive at McLaren by hiding a broken wrist in the Formula Super A Championship. In 2001, Hamilton had already been identified as a future star, signing on to McLaren's driver development program, but injured his wrist in an off-track accident. In pursuit of a title and wanting to keep his career intact, Hamilton hid the injury from his team bosses and continued to race, effectively only using one hand. He eventually fell to 15th in the standings, 1 point ahead of Nico Rosberg, but his determination ultimately earned him a debut F1 drive with McLaren in 2007, winning a world title a year later. The legendary career of Graham Hill was set to come to an unexpected end after a crash at the 1969 US Grand Prix, caused by a high-speed puncture. The impact broke both his legs and confined the former F1 world champion to a wheelchair for months. Having enjoyed a highly successful F1 career up until that point, it was a surprise when the 41-year-old returned to the paddock for the following year, lifted into the car for the 1970 South African Grand Prix. Starting 19th, Hill rose through the field to finish a brilliant 6th in what would be his last great performance in an F1 Grand Prix, reduced to occasional points finishes until his retirement in 1972. Having signed for Benetton ahead of the 1988 F1 season, Johnny Herbert's once glittering career took a sudden turn when he was involved in a horrifying F3000 crash at Brands Hatch, breaking his legs, ankles and feet in several places. Told he would never walk again, let alone race, Herbert defied the odds in his eventual F1 debut in Rio de Janeiro, finishing 4th in the 1989 Brazilian Grand Prix. The race took place less than 6 months after Herbert's incident, with the Briton still having to use crutches to move around the paddock. No stranger to racing despite personal suffering, Jean Behra rose to new painful heights when he was showered in hot oil due to a split exhaust during the 1957 French Grand Prix. In considerable pain, the Frenchman later parked on the pit straight, allowing his Maserati to coast across the line to claim 6th place, 7 laps behind the eventual race winner. On his day, the Frenchman had been a match for some of the best drivers F1 had to offer, winning 12 non-championship races and also earned a reputation for competing at all costs, even battling flames with his bare hands at the 1957 Venezuelan Grand Prix during a refueling stop. Behra was also injured midway through the 1957 season when involved in a tractor accident, breaking his ribs, but continued to race throughout the year. While his talent was significant, Behra never won an F1 Grand Prix, missing out due to a flurry of misfortune before suffering a fatal crash in 1959. Ricky Rudd may be the only non-Grand Prix driver on this list, but by no means is his push through the pain barrier any less spectacular. Having swapped cars with Dale Earnhardt ahead of the 1984 Bud Clash at Daytona, Rudd suffered a massive 200-mile-an-hour shunt, his car somersaulting 9 times. Remarkably, Rudd escaped with nothing more than facial injuries and torn cartilage in his ribcage, ready to race again just 2 days later in the Daytona 500. With his swollen eyes taped open, he finished a distant 7th behind eventual race winner Cale Yarborough, but managed to win next time out in Richmond. Rudd was diagnosed with a concussion just 2 races later when his face swelling returned, leading to a full investigation by NASCAR into concussion protocol. If there were any other incredible comebacks we missed, make sure to tell us in the comments down below, and don't forget to subscribe for more motorsport content.